on behalf of authors at Kirkland. I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us. And I also want to welcome our guest, Katherine Hitchcock, to Google. Katherine is a resident of the Seattle region. She's also a UW alumnus. And she came into the industry at a very key time. She started at IBM as a programmer in 1966, in what would eventually become the Silicon Valley that we know and love today. I'm sure it's a very different landscape now than what she had experienced when she started, but she's a big reason the way that it's come to be, and people like her. She's witnessed that amazing transformation of the tech industry, and she has a really unique perspective and insight, and she'll be sharing some tales with us today about her journey. And she's going to show us, and demonstrate how she's been paving the way. And as you saw in the clip, she's continuing to do that. And that's amazing. She's honing the skills of a new generation, inspiring more kids to take up the reins, and contributing to programs right in our area. And that's awesome to me. After the talk, Katherine will be happy to take your questions, and then we'll have some time where she will do some signing. Books are available for purchase over on the table. They're $5 a piece. And other than that, please silence your phones. At the end, like I said, we'll have time to take questions, so hold on to those if you can. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Katherine Hitchcock.
Thank you for inviting me. And as Jen said, I started as a computer programmer 50 years ago. I retired 15 years ago. And if you look at when Google started, maybe 18 years ago, there's a lot that's happened since I retired. And I will tell you that I have no advantage over my grandchildren on all of the new technology that's coming out. But what I can tell you about is what it was like when I started. So, as Jen said, I graduated from the University of Washington in 1966. I have a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics, and I hired on to IBM in San Jose. And I want to let you know what it was like at IBM 50 years ago, what was happening and going on. I'd like to share with you a couple of the projects that I worked on at the beginning, and then I'd like to talk to you about an environmental project that I worked on. So when I arrived in 1966 in Santa Clara County, it was just at that transition from when we were using punched cards to communicate to computers to when we were using terminals and having interactive interface. So the first project that I worked on was with the punched card environment. But there was something else going on there also. And so just 10 years before I arrived in San Jose, so that would have been in the mid-50s, IBM engineers had invented the disk drive. So this is the coated surfaces spinning at high speed with the heads floating over the surface, just a microscope above them. And if they dipped down and touched, causing a head crash. But this technology that was invented in the early 50s led to IBM having this location in South San Jose. This is where they built the disk drive. This is where the engineers innovated and added new functions to it. And this project, these small number of engineers who invented the disk drive, were continually asked to stop the project. In fact, upper management would come from back east and cancel the project. The manager changed the name of the project and kept everybody working on it. And there's a quote here. It's a quote actually that I kept on my desk for a long time because I liked the sentiment. It said, "The disk memory unit, the heart of today's random access computer, is not the logical outcome of a decision made by IBM management. It was developed in one of our laboratories as a bootleg project over the stern warning from management that the project had to be dropped because of budget difficulties. A handful of men ignored this warning. They broke the rules. They risked their job to work on a project that they believed in." And this was a quote from Arthur K. Watson, who was the son of Thomas J. Watson, who was the founder. So as I said, this technology led to the construction of the IBM Cottle Road location. And prior to that, this large piece of property was a farm with orchards. The farmhouse still stood at the edge of the property, across from acres of parking lots and large manufacturing buildings. Inside these manufacturing buildings, a team of employees assembled the disk drives, while another team worked in a special clean room, a dust-free environment to coat the magnetic disks. Another building offered office space for engineers who designed innovations and improvements and enhancements to the disk technology. One building contained a research lab, and another an education center. This facility was the headquarters for the disk drive division of IBM, and it was the only division whose headquarters was not in New York State. And all these things were there when I arrived in 1966. My workspace was located in a large, open, high-ceiling manufacturing building called Building 5. And I'd walk through a maze of passageways to my work area, a desk with a bookshelf attached to the back to provide privacy. At the other end of the building, running batch programs, was the computer. And in order to submit a batch job, I had to pick up my output, I had to walk the length of this building through this labyrinth. I often thought it was a test. If you couldn't find your way through the maze, you probably were not smart enough to work here. My first assignment was to modify a batch program written in autocoder. It was one of the many programs involved in purchasing the parts and tracking the parts for manufacturing the disk drive. The technical leader in our department gave me this assignment, and when I asked him about the documentation for the program, he said, "There is none. Find out what it does by reading the code." I sat at my desk, almost falling asleep, studying this obscure code. Weeks later, when I figured everything out and made my modification, the same guy gave me the documentation. I looked at him dumbfounded, since he told me there was none. He said, "I wanted you to learn that the code is the reality, not what the documentation says." This was my first lesson. Within a short time, IBM announced a new programming language. It was called PL1. And one of my colleagues, Bert Swanson, organized and taught a class on PL1, and I was a student in that class. At the end, Bert asked me to teach the next class. He indicated that he only wanted to teach it once as a way of learning PL1. So I taught the series several times in a row to the newly arriving programmers in our area. And then I taught it as part of the IBM continuing education program that was offered in the beautiful new education center. This was available to anybody working at IBM, along with other classes. And I taught it in the evening, in addition to my normal work assignments, for a couple of years. On this building, there was a quote from Thomas J. Watson, and it said, "There's no saturation point to education." So this education was open to all employees. Then I was assigned to a remote computing project to design and build an interactive online purchasing system to be used by the IBM manufacturing location. This was an endeavor to eliminate the duplicate efforts, update to the latest computer system, operating system, which by now is OS 360, and standardize the purchasing programs within IBM. We were redesigning the purchasing process from a punched card batch system to an interactive system using remote terminals. Currently, the purchasing staff relied on weekly computer runs that printed a stack of fan-fold paper, giving them the status and the current information about the inventory. They didn't have display terminals at their desk, and they did not have the latest information on the inventory at their fingertips. We were creating something new, something that we hadn't seen before, and there was no template that we could copy. We needed to distinguish out the necessary steps for placing a purchase order, determine how to store the data on the disk device, and design display screens for the interaction. But even as I itemize these different tasks, I'm looking in hindsight. At the time, It was a confusing, unfocused attempt to figure out what to do. Many new programmers had been hired and assigned to the project, but we were too inexperienced to make progress. And I felt it was a waste of time to teach a programming language to employees who were not going to be using it anytime soon. I was discouraged, and I wanted results. And after months of struggling on this project, I decided to look for another assignment. So in early January of 1968, while hiking one weekend with friends, I reviewed the working conditions and debated my options. By the end of the hike, I had decided the situation at work was unacceptable, and I would request a transfer. There weren't publicly available lists of jobs. You needed to request a transfer, submit it to the personnel department, and then they would tell you if any managers were looking for a job. This time, he let me know that there was an opening for a programming position in another IBM location, which was located across the valley near Los Gatos. Now, I mentioned previously about the disk technology that led to this large manufacturing and engineering offices and education center, but there was another result that came out of that group of engineers working together, and their manager, the one who changed the name of the project each time it was canceled, this manager's name was Ray Johnson. And with the success of the disk drive, upper management took him very seriously. And they started a new division within IBM based on his philosophy. And this division had the specific mission of looking ahead to see how computers would be used in the next 7 to 10 years. This was called the Advanced Systems Development Division, and this was the location that was looking for a programmer. I knew that one of my students in my PL1 class worked there. And so one day I asked him, Bob Martin, if he would stay after class and tell me about this division, about ASDD. He said, with the success of the disk project, Ray influenced IBM to start this new division based on his philosophy. And his philosophy, I asked, to have a place for people to work on new ideas for the future. Ray wanted to hire smart engineers and programmers, give them a good working environment with good support facilities, and let the innovation come from them. This lab had an excellent model shop where they could build any specialized piece of electrical hardware for the project. And there was an excellent technical library that had started when they first arrived in the 50s. In fact, many of the engineers and model builders from that early project worked at this lab, including the head librarian. You're saying the ideas come from the employees, I asked. How does that work? If you have an idea about how computers can be used in a certain area, then you can propose it to management and receive funding and staff for it. It's a good working place. There's a lot of excellent people, and the projects are dynamic. It's a great place to work. So I drove over for my interview, and this building, ASDD building, was nestled against the foothills, up against the Santa Cruz Mountains. It was an innovative design, a simple one-story building constructed of redwood and glass. And walking from the visitors' parking lot up a few steps into the main lobby, I looked across an interior window-lined courtyard with a fountain. A plaque on the fountain quoted Ray Johnson. Your first responsibility is to answer the questions of your colleagues. The project with the opening was for a programmer in the library management system. The librarian, Marjorie Griffin, who had worked with Ray, had watched the development of computers, and she envisioned how they could help run her technical library. And finally, she convinced the lab to start a project. We're not just looking at Marjorie's library, but the requirements for large institutional libraries like university and public libraries. We want to put all the functions online with an interactive interface. He told me that at that time, in the mid-1960s, as computers were becoming increasingly available, the different managers at university or public libraries were ordering computers to solve a particular departmental problem. Perhaps they wanted to automate the ordering process or the circulation process. But these systems were not designed to interconnect to one another, and they were looking at the library in a piecemeal fashion. This project was to look at it in an integrated whole. We have the file system designed and loaded with all the information from the index cards of Marjorie's library, I was told. And now we're ready to design and implement the other functions, the ordering, receiving, cataloging, searching, circulation. Did I want the job? Well, I had reservations. At first glance, it seemed like another example of a large project trying to do everything for everyone. But this project had several advantages. For one thing, they were actually writing programs and building the system. For another, the library and the librarians were just down the hall, and we could ask them questions about how it should work. And in addition, there were only about 5 programmers working on the project, so there were fewer people to coordinate with, and I decided to take the job. And thus began a most productive and satisfying assignment. Bob Martin, who was in my PL1 class, was the lead programmer on the project. I was in an interesting, unusual situation where he would give me programming assignments during the day for the library project, and I would give him programming assignments for the PL1 class I was teaching after work. All the library data for each book, each author, subject, was stored in computerized records on the disk drive. At this time, disk storage was very expensive, and it was not foreseen how the price would drop. The file system design minimized the use of disk storage and eliminated duplicate data. He repeatedly said that 1 extra byte of data per book would amount to 1 million extra bytes of data in a 1,000,000-volume library. So the attention to saving disk space was a guiding factor. With the file system designed, implemented, and loaded with real data, we were soon displaying the results of simple searches on this display terminal. The display terminal was a 2260 display terminal. It had 12 lines of data for the output. Each line was 80 bytes long, and it had 1 line at the bottom for input. Bob explained the programming environment. The programming language was IBM 360 assembler language. The code was written in 4K blocks, and an experimental multitasking monitor managed the task switching by swapping the blocks in and out of memory. This experimental multitasking monitor was stored on one of the removable disk packs, and whenever our project had dedicated computer time for testing, we mounted the disk pack, booted up the operating system with our multitasking monitor that drove the displays, and then all the library data was stored on another disk pack that was mounted at the same time. I enjoyed writing in assembler language and fitting all my instructions into 4K blocks. I also enjoyed working with the librarians as I taught them the new functions and features as they were developed. They were eager to use the new system and very patient with the crashes that inevitably occurred in the new system. They were particularly good about describing what they were doing when everything quit, and that made it easier to reproduce the problem and fix it. John Bell and I worked on the design and implementation of the ordering system. We wanted to capture the information about a book only once and eliminate the duplicate typing that always led to possibility of errors. Currently, the librarians type this information over and over again on the purchase order and on the multitude of index cards for the card cataloging. One by one, we implemented the ordering and receiving and cataloging functions. And one by one, we taught the librarians how to use them. Step by step, the library functions were being automated into one integrated system. There were still more functions to design and implement. Periodicals had different requirements. Circulation had not been addressed yet. In the midst of this designing, programming, debugging, testing, and teaching, we were also giving demonstrations on the system, both to upper management and outside visitors. The librarians from Stanford University were our guests one afternoon, and their eyes sparkled in recognition of the advantage of this online integrated library system. Once I gave a demonstration to the IBM chief scientist. He sat on my left. I began my demonstration of the file system, the searching, the ordering, and I had finished only half of my first explanation when he interrupted me to say, "Go on." This happened several times, and I must have had a startled expression on my face with each interruption. Then he paused to say, "I do this to everyone. Now, please go on." I realized that he caught on very quickly to each idea and did not need further explanation, probably why he was the chief scientist. I started working on an advanced searching function. I designed and implemented a Boolean one. It was very primitive, and I wished for something more sophisticated, but I did not have the vision to design it. And today, search engines like you have here in Google exceed my wildest imagination. As we finished the basic functions, we opened the system for general use by the scientists and engineers, and the card catalog and the index cards became obsolete. Then, the library project system was canceled. It was mid-1969. I'd been on the project for over a year, and I remember the shock when I learned this. It was too unbelievable. We weren't done. But the political winds had shifted, and we had lost our funding. This was 1969 when we demonstrated the library project. It was many years before libraries were automated in the way that we envisioned, and it wasn't done by IBM. But we had built an interactive application that modeled how people could interact with computers via a terminal. We were well on our way out of that batch mode into an interactive way of working with the computer, and we were going forward. Now I'd like to turn to an environmental project that I did. I started a couple, but I'd like to tell you about one of them. By now, I lived with a group of women in Atherton, which is kind of in the middle of Silicon Valley. I worked in the Los Gatos lab, which was in the hills on the south end of the valley. And so I commuted in a carpool with a fellow colleague who was a recent graduate from Stanford. And after about an hour of driving, we would arrive at the lab. During this commute, I realized how many cars on the road had only one person per car. I thought people could share rides if they only knew other people who lived near them and were going the same way. I figured out how to write a computer program to match people coming from the same area and going to IBM. It involved putting their name and home location, specified as coordinates on a city map, on a punched card. The cards would be sorted and then printed to give each person a list of people from their area. I wrote the program and tested it. And I went to the IBM personnel department, which today would be called HR, to offer this as a service to the employees. I met with the personnel manager in his office. It was an office just big enough for his desk and 2 guest chairs. And I sat down. I've written a computer program to match people by where they live so they can form carpools to come to work, I said by way of introduction. But the personnel manager wasn't interested. The way people get to and from work is their responsibility, not IBM's, he said dismissively. I was flustered. I had not expected to be met with this opposition to what I considered a contribution. And what could I say? But IBM is subsidizing people riding individual cars because IBM is paying a huge amount of money for parking lots. He sat across from me and reached for a cigarette. Perhaps he was uncomfortable and had no response for my obviously true observation. Since he was not going to be of any help with promoting the carpool idea, I said, well, maybe I could stand out in the parking lot and give out information forms to people to see how many would be interested in carpooling. His hand stopped in midair with the lit match aiming at his cigarette. And he looked directly into my eyes and said, that would not be a good idea. And with chilling firmness. It was strong enough to stop me from further discussion, and I left his office. I did not realize at the moment what he was saying, but I understood later. I had touched on a very sensitive nerve. Any action that looked like organizing employees would seem like an effort to unionize IBM. My comment about handing out questionnaires was too close to organizing for him to be comfortable. I returned to my office and put the computer program, this stack of cards, on the corner of my desk. I had no place to file it, and I wanted it to stay in my awareness. And for months and months it sat on my desk, always reminding me of what I was trying to accomplish. 2 years later, when the 1973 oil embargo started, and gas prices soared, and people had to wait in long lines to purchase fuel, I received a call from the personnel manager asking about my program to match people for carpools. And this is when IBM implemented my carpool program. A map was posted on the bulletin board with information about how to participate. I never knew how successful it was in terms of how many people were matched or how many carpools were formed. But for many years, I continued to see the map posted on the bulletin board. About this time, the ASDD lab, the division of ASDD, which had that location in Los Gatos, and by the way, it had another location in Mohansic, New York, IBM terminated the division. When this happened, it wasn't a big surprise for me. I could see that the division no longer functioned according to its original mission. No longer were the ideas initiated by the engineers and programmers, and instead a more structured management team dictated the projects. So I was a little bit at a loss, restless for a change, and not really sure what was next for me. And then one fairly normal work day, as I was finishing up my project for the lab, I attended a late morning seminar. I walked into the auditorium and took a seat. The speaker, Jacqueline Wexler, who was the president of Hunter College in New York City, was talking about change, about how so many young people wanted change, big change and radical change. This was the early 70s and unrest and protest on the campus. Then she spoke about the realistic, steady path of change, growth, and progress. As I sat there and her presentation flowed over me, and she was speaking on some of the same things I've been struggling with, how change occurs for people, for corporations, and for societies. I knew there was a luncheon following the presentation, and I knew Marjorie Griffin, the librarian, had arranged for the speaker. Marjorie, I said, and I ran up to her, I want to come to the luncheon. She looked at her guest list and shook her head. I'm sorry, all the places are taken. And I turned and walked away, still excited by the ideas. I knew some of the people on the guest list. The retired founder of our lab, Ray Johnson, was attending with his wife. As I slowly walked back through the auditorium, immersed in my thoughts, and then a moment later, Marjorie stopped me. Ray's wife couldn't make it. You can have her place at the luncheon. And this all happened so fast that I could barely catch my breath. The next thing I knew, I was seated at a long table with white tablecloth and place settings for 20 people. I looked around to locate the speaker. She sat off to my right, down at the other end of the table, too far away for me to be able to talk to her or even hear her conversation. I was introduced to the man sitting on my left. He was an IBM vice president. My first comment to him was, how do corporations change if they keep promoting into management people who think the same way as the current managers? To his credit, he responded by asking, what would you like to see changed? Well, this wasn't going to be an abstract conversation about change. He directed me immediately to the practical. Well, I said, I've written a computer program to match people so they can carpool to work. And when I went to the personnel department to offer this, they said it was the employee's responsibility, not IBM's. He sidestepped me once again when he asked, do you know about the work that Dr. Pat Manti is doing in the San Jose Research Division? It's a project involving geographic database problems. And no, I didn't. Well, he said, you should go talk to him, and I'll call him and let him know to expect you. The result of the luncheon was an appointment the next day with Dr. Manti, and here I learned about the ideas they were exploring to solve a class of problems that required geographical data. They were looking at how to organize the data to facilitate searches based on location, path, and direction. He felt that my idea of matching people for carpools was exactly the kind of geographical problem they were addressing. Did I want to come and spend the summer as an internship working with them? And of course I did. This led to a summer working on the GADS project, and it stood for Geographical Access Data Storage. And it was very early research in how to store data for sorting and retrieving geographical data. I redesigned my carpool program to use the GADS data structures. It was a wonderful summer of engaging work with bright, forward-thinking colleagues. It didn't result in any carpools. But this summer was my introduction to working and knowing about IBM research. So the IBM San Jose Research Lab, which was located right there next to the manufacturing and development of the disk storage device, had a focus on projects that could enhance the disk technology, both in terms of material science research, like the coding material, and in terms of computer science research. Ted Codd, the inventor of the relational model for database management, worked here and wrote his 1970 paper on relational databases. And Don Chamberlain and Raymond Boyce, who defined SQL, or SQL, as a special purpose programming language, worked here. John Bacchus, already named as an IBM Fellow for inventing Fortran, worked here also. I went on to other projects, but a few years later, I came back and I started working at the research lab, and I finished my career working at the lab. That building that was on the San Jose plant site, they built a new lab up in the hills, just adjacent to that Cottle Road facility. And the research lab continues to be a dynamic environment with an impressive list of inventions and discoveries that continue to this day. And then I'd like to give you a little bit of a retrospective, because as I said, I stopped working in 2001, but in 2006, I was in San Jose, and I decided to go back and have lunch with some of my colleagues at the IBM Almaden Research Center. And as I was driving there, I had a flood of memories from when I first drove down that highway 40 years earlier to interview for a job. And reflecting on that day in my senior year at the university and my subsequent decision to accept the IBM offer, I pondered how things had turned out. As I continued down the highway, I turned right at the entrance to the IBM Cottle Road site where I first started. And I was surprised see a Hitachi sign next to the IBM sign. I noted this and continued on my way a few more miles before I turned up into the foothills and approached the Almaden lab. And at the entrance to this lab, there were two signs, IBM and Hitachi. What did this mean? I walked into the lobby of the IBM Almaden lab, and I saw a large celebratory display acknowledging the 50th anniversary of the random access disk technology developed by those engineers. 50 years, I mused to myself. And I was here 40 years ago, very close to the beginning. I left the lobby and walked down the wide hallway toward the cafeteria, floor-to-ceiling glass windows on my right, and beautiful blue-green tile under my feet. And on the wall to the left were a row of plaques with photos and descriptions of people who had recently received IBM Outstanding Technical Achievement Awards or Research Division Awards. And I smiled, remembering when I had been the recipient. In the cafeteria, I joined my colleagues, several of whom I had known and worked with for over 25 years. At lunch, I asked about the Hitachi signs, and I learned that IBM had sold the magnetic disk drive business to Hitachi. What a surprise. 50 years after its invention, 50 years of continuing innovation and improvement, IBM no longer owned the magnetic disk technology. I thought about how close I was to the beginning, since I had started just 10 years after its invention. I returned to my car and thought that time has brought 40 years of change to me and to IBM. In retrospect, I used very little of the math classes that I studied at the University of Washington. Mostly I used my logic and problem-solving skills. I liked writing and debugging programs. It fit well with my logical thinking patterns, and each program was like a challenging puzzle. Early in my career, when the library project was canceled, and I was struggling with the challenges of the meaning of life and on the brink of a discouraging attitude, another employee said to me, "You'll get used to the disappointments and give up on your ideals." I wondered when and if this would happen. Fortunately, there were several turning points in my career and lessons learned that carried me onward into exciting and challenging projects. I not only found my way, but actively participated in creating my way during this time of rapidly changing technology. Thank you. So, would you like to ask any questions?
We have a mic up here, and I can come to you if you want to raise your hand. I'm more than happy to.
Hi, thank you. So from the timeline of your early career, it looks to me like you're working on a library system very similar to the time that Doug Engelbart had developed this very famous demo of user interactions with computers using a mouse and other things like that. And I wondered if at the time, if that was something you were aware of, or how that, because obviously ideas like that were just about to change the industry really dramatically.
Yes. Well, I had the opportunity of visiting his lab early. But it still would have been about 1972. So the library project was 68 and 69. But in about 1972, I visited his lab and saw the mouse, and was quite amazed. But didn't really see a use of it for several years afterwards. But if you look at, punching holes in cards to communicate to computers, typing at a terminal to communicate to computers, moving a mouse to communicate, to touching, to swiping, we've made a lot of progress. And to speaking.
First, just one observation. I was in Peru last month and dropped into the library for some reason, even though I speak no Spanish. And there was a card catalog there, and I hadn't really thought about them for a very long time, and certainly hadn't seen one for a while. But I guess they do still exist. I didn't see anybody using it, so it may be that they just haven't cleared it out yet. But my question was, you in all your stories, you didn't mention anything about how it was being a woman in what was at that time and still is largely now a man's industry. And I was wondering you must have had some problems with people's attitudes back then. Your thoughts on that?
Thank you for your question. When I hired on in 1966, it was a big year for hiring new people. Corporations were hiring a lot of people. And in my area, there were 4 women programmers that had been hired. In fact, I would say more than that, because these 4 lived near myself and my roommate, who was a programmer, and we carpooled together. So with that environment, it didn't look unusual to be a woman in the environment. I will say that in most meetings, it was about 5%. If I looked around the room and saw how many men or women there were, it would be 5, maybe going up to 10%. I think my focus was on solving the problems. If there was things coming at me that were, I just didn't hear them or see them. I don't think it was a conscious effort. I think it's just the way I was, that I would be looking at the problems. I do remember at that time being kind of mystified, because there was a man who had been hired, and he was working in our area, and we were told that he was being groomed to work in this project, and then in that project, and then on up in the corporation. And there was like, well, who's going to groom me? And there's a project, so I didn't feel that discrimination personally. And I do know that later on, there was a time when a woman in my department, which might have been 30 people in the department, was leaving, and she came to me and she was very upset with me. And she said, "You've never supported me." And it was her wanting that networking of women. And she felt like I had not provided that for her. And I can see in retrospect where I could have provided something that I didn't. And in my view, I was just really focusing on what problems that I was solving. I do talk about one incident where I walked into a lab. The guys were there taking apart a piece of equipment. It was a new printer. It was right after I had worked on the GAS project. I knew about this printer. I knew it was a graphics printer. And as they were setting it up, there was a black line that came across the printer. And they were saying, "Oh, it must be that clicking sound." And I said, "No, there's light getting in." Because I knew the printer, and I knew it was a photographic process. And he said, "There's something open, and it's exposing the paper, and the light is getting in and causing the black line." And I said this a couple of times, and finally they discovered it. But they didn't discover it because I said it. And it was like, well, wish they'd listen to me. Does that, I think I was kind of oblivious to it, or maybe that's why I'm saying it's atypical, or if you were looking for a story about how much I had to fight for my rights, it's not my story. And I hope that other people will tell it. And in fact, as I share this story, I've had women come up to me and say, "Well, I got in my physics class, my physics professor, I guess it was in high school, would not give me an A because he had to give it to the men, because the men had to support a family." And here was a woman who just was enthralled with science and met with that kind of thing. And I told her she should write her book.
So in the book, you talk about the different work environments that you had worked in, and we talked a little bit about this earlier. How do you feel thinking about how the open office environment and the busy workplace that you observed at Google, what would that environment be like for you to work in today? Would that be productive for you?
Well, I have to say the cafeteria was very noisy. But walking through the workspace, you didn't have anywhere near that amount of noise whatsoever. So we had for us at that time to get an office, first of all, when I worked at the Los Gatos lab, we had 2 people per office. And actually, I think I'd like to say something about my office mate, because Alice was my office mate there at one time, and she was about 15 years older than I and had a degree in math from Berkeley, and she'd been working as a computer programmer. So I had some models of different people who were in this, different women who were in this. But the desire to have your own office was very strong. So we had 2 people offices, and then when they opened that Los Gatos, the Almaden Research Lab, we had 1-person offices. And so to see everything going back to open is, it's interesting. I don't know how it is. You guys have to say how it is to work in that environment.
So we've all worked on that project that got canceled and put those hours and hours of time and tribulation and blood, sweat, and tears in only to have it canceled or moved or changed or defragged or whatever word you want to use for it. Just like you did with the library system. How did you get through that? How did you cope through it? Provide us with some insight. It was a very difficult situation to be in.
It was. It really was. When you see something that you think will really contribute and you put your heart in it, it's very hard, very, very hard to have it canceled. And there were other projects, none of them quite as fond to me as the library project. It takes time. I guess I don't know that I can answer it directly, but I will tell you that because Los Gatos Lab was an experimental environment, because they were looking at showing ideas, improving them. And in the book, I talk about some of the ideas that they showed and improved, like the barcode and the ATM were developed in those labs. But because it was a lab for proving things and showing them, I never really ended up taking something all the way to completion. And by the time I had started here with the GADS project or something, and even just working on it for a summer, I never had that sense of taking something from the beginning to completion. And I realized that, and I talk about this later in the book, that I had developed a perception that nothing would ever come of anything. That was my perception. And then I realized how my perception influenced how I worked. And there's a very conscious moment in this book where I make that decision to change my perception, where I change it from the perception of nothing ever goes anywhere to I'm going to work on projects that succeed. And I had a way of doing that. I had just attended a lecture that talked about how to build that confidence in people that they can solve a problem. And I think it's connected back to these kids coding. Because if you can see that you can solve a problem, well then it's like, oh, well I can solve another problem. You start to build that perception in you that I can solve problems, as opposed to that perception that I had set problems that I couldn't. So I decided to get a project that was a short project, not short by today's terms, for instance, and one that had not many people and that would succeed. And I was very fortunate to get that done. And then that really changed my outlook. But I consciously worked on it, that instead of having, oh, nothing's working, why should I work such long hours, to the projects I worked on are going to succeed. And that, I would say, is probably the major accomplishment of my career, is to have made that shift.
Google's corporate seems to work better for you and for the products?
Well, I think there needs to be a place for both in the organization. Certainly if you've got a product that you want to get out in a timely manner, then you want the whole team focused on that. But the place to be able to bring in the new ideas, if you look around, probably a lot of new ideas get started in new companies, maybe because they can't survive in an old company. I don't know. But I do think that the corporation needs to have both of those and really foster that environment of ideas coming from the people. That's where your brilliance is.
And thank you so much for coming, Catherine. We're really happy to have you here.
Thank you, and thank you all for